Perfect. Thank you for everyone for joining us today. As we start letting people roll in, we're going to wait a couple of minutes to allow everyone else to log in. We have two speakers today. Welcome to the League of Women Voters of California webinar on solutions to housing and homelessness problems from around the state. Allow me to introduce our speakers for today. Our first speaker is Pedro Galval, who is the Deputy Director for Legislation at the California Department of Housing and Community Development. He has an excellent track record of affordable housing victories at the local, regional, and state levels. We also have our second speaker, Ryan Finnegan. He is a Senior Research Associate for the Turner Center for Housing Innovation, helping design and execute the center's research agenda. His research has focused on homelessness in California and poverty and social policy, both in the United States overall and internationally. So with that, I see that we have quite a bit of our participants logged in. Perfect. Let's hear from our incredible speakers today. If you think of any questions, feel free to enter them into the Q&A section on the Zoom, and we will get to them at the end of the webinar. So we'll go ahead and start with our first speaker, Pedro.
Thank you so much for that welcome, Jaleesa, and thank you so much to the League of Women Voters for having me here tonight. The League does excellent work, and before coming to HCD, I used to be at the Nonprofit Housing Association Northern California, and the League of Women Voters in the Bay Area. They were a tremendous partner to us in getting a lot of good affordable housing victories through. So just really grateful to be here and grateful for the work that this group does. So I am going to share my screen. Let's see. Can you all see at least, is it in presentation mode? Because I have two screens up. So you can see the screen and its presentation.
It's not on presentation mode, but we can see the screen.
Oh, okay, got it. Hold on, this is what this is what happens when you have multiple screens. Let's do that again. No, 1 second, let me try this a different way. How about now? Did that work?
Works perfectly.
Okay, great. For this webinar, the way that it's framed, I thought it might be helpful to just describe to you all the work that the department's doing, how we look at housing and homelessness issues and the general solutions that we're focusing on, and then be happy to take questions. So just kind of starting with our mission. We have a pretty ambitious mission, which is to promote safe and affordable homes and vibrant, inclusive, sustainable communities for all Californians. But really when it comes down to it is the Department of Housing and Community Development is the primary department that deals with housing issues on behalf of the state. We work from the local level onwards to the state as a whole on housing policy, and we're focused on multiple areas. One of our primary focuses is providing funding to increase the supply of affordable places to live in California. And how we define affordable housing is housing that is restricted by income level to people making at 80% or below of the area median income. So that'll vary depending on what region you're in. But the department provides funding to build this type of housing, and this housing remains affordable for at least 55 years. We also preserve affordable homes. And those are homes that either we previously funded or was funded at the local level, and we make sure that that those homes can remain subsidized and affordable for the long term. Something that you might not know that we do is we also oversee mobile home parks and manufactured housing. We do quite a bit of work in making sure that those parks remain safe and quality places to live for Californians. Um, One area that was actually news to me that we also regulate is we oversee building codes and standards for all residential buildings. So if you've heard of CalGreen, that's the nation's first green building code, green building code that is mandatory at the state level. So HCD implements that and updates that. We make sure that cities and counties are planning for enough housing to accommodate all of their population, and we hold cities accountable to make sure that they do it. And we also do a lot of housing research and try to promote solutions to our crisis in that way. So there's three big solutions that the department is focused on, and I'm going to be talking about it from a legislative and budget perspective. My role at HCD is to myself and my team, we review all housing bills that are introduced in the legislature, look at their impact on the state and on HCD. And for those that pass out of the legislature to the governor, we make recommendations to him on whether or not he should sign or veto. And so my presentation will be focused on more the legislative and budget solutions, but happy to talk about our programs as well. So going back, there's three big focuses: keeping Californians in their homes, because if we keep people safely and affordably housed, then that helps that helps prevent homelessness, that keeps our community stable. Um, Building more affordable and climate smart housing. So um, housing that is income restricted and also near transit, so we can address both our housing crisis and our climate crisis, and continue to act with urgency to address our homelessness crisis and the housing need of California as a whole. Um, so this past year, it was a banner year for housing legislation. There were 249 housing bills introduced, and 53 of those became laws. That's a huge number. When I started doing this work about a decade ago, we were lucky if there were 10 housing bills and three became laws. And so now we've had 249 and 53 became laws. So just to give you a sense, and that's because the problem is, it has not gotten that much better. You know, it's still a huge problem for Californians. The governor is still prioritizing this as his number one issue, and voters have consistently named this as their top issue. So it's right that the legislature has so much interest. And this administration has invested so far 11.2 billion in various solutions to address housing and homelessness issues. So I'm going to go through those at a high level now. So in the goal of keeping Californians in their homes, HCD has been the entity that has been deploying rental assistance to keep people housed during COVID. So far, we've deployed over $4 billion and we've helped over 370,000 households stay housed by providing them with rental assistance. We also monitor properties that receive subsidies but that are at risk of converting to market rate, and we try to intervene to keep them affordable for the long term, especially those properties that we previously funded. And we're going to be setting up a program next year to buy homes that have been foreclosed on and convert those to affordable housing. This year, we also, the governor signed SB 940, which really expanded rent control for mobile home parks in places in cities that have mobile home park rent control. So typical rent control, there aren't that many cities in California that have it. But for mobile home park rent control, there's actually 100 cities plus that have it in the state. But their reach was really limited, but by a different law that made it so that you couldn't have new mobile homes be under rent control if they were built after 1990. And this bill, SB 940, brings all of those mobile homes under rent control in places where it's in place. And um, this governor also signed AB 1482 back in 2019, which established a statewide rent cap, which means that rent increases in California by law have to be kept below a certain level. Whereas previously there were no protections, rents could go up to, whatever they were going to go up to. In this budget, this past year, there is also major investments in housing, affordable housing production and homeownership. We saw $2 billion be invested in affordable housing production, and this is going for the production of really deeply affordable housing for people experiencing homelessness, all the way to, people who are working full time, have jobs, but just don't make enough to afford a decent place to live. So we've had $2 billion invested in that kind of housing, and 850 million to bolster home ownership. And that also runs the gamut from low-income Californians all the way up to people who, again, make too little to afford what's in the market. And so some significant investments there to make the dream of home ownership possible. With 53 housing bills, I'm not going to cover all of them because we would be here all night. So instead, I'm focusing on 3 big bills that passed. And I love your cat, Ryan. and I'm glad that they are interested. So 3 big bills that passed this year, AB 2011, SB 6, and AB 2097. So here in this picture, you see huge parking lots and a Macy's and this other empty shopping mall. So both AB 2011 and SB 6 will make it easier to convert these empty shopping malls into housing. Places that have current zoning that is commercial or retail will now be able to be converted into housing. Per AB 2011, that housing will need to be at least 15% affordable. And the workers who build those homes will need to be paid high-level wages that are also known as prevailing wages. With SB 6, depending on which approach developers use, with SB 6, they don't have to provide affordable housing, but they do have to hire workers who are skilled and trained. These are workers who are typically union and who are highly qualified in their craft to build these homes. And so you're either building in areas of the state where you're paying union wages, or you're hiring highly qualified unionized workers to build these homes, and you're providing affordability. With AB 2097, what that bill does is when a developer typically builds housing, they have to provide a certain number of parking spaces. And what this bill does is it says if you're building your transit, you don't have to provide any minimum parking. And that's because the idea is to encourage more housing near transit that is walkable, so decreasing car dependency. And so that was a pretty remarkable bill because generally speaking, parking can cost between $40,000 to $80,000 per space, and that cost is passed down to the consumer. So we expect this bill to make housing cheaper to build. And collectively, these bills will greatly increase how much housing is built in transit-oriented areas in places that are already built up. There's also significant investment in homelessness interventions. This past budget made a $3.4 billion investment, including $1 billion going to cities and counties. Recently, you may have heard that the governor actually paused the $1 billion that was going to cities and counties because he wanted to see more accountability in plans to decrease homelessness. While that convening happened, local governments some of them resubmitted their plans, and the idea is that yes, they're going to get funding, but we want to make sure that the state keeps its momentum at decreasing the number of people who are experiencing homelessness in any given night. And the governor also signed a number of bills to make deploy funding faster for homelessness programs and cut red tape. And there's three of them that I note here. And I want to just call your attention to AB 1978, which um, makes it far easier for the state to deploy federal funding. We get billions of dollars of federal funding every year. There's a lot of red tape associated with it. AB 1978 just makes it a lot easier and faster to provide that funding upfront to organizations who are quickly going to deploy it to help to provide homelessness solutions. And finally, um, we also have a lot of state and local partnerships. As I mentioned with the pause of the $1 billion for homelessness funding, that has to do with accountability. The governor established a new housing accountability unit under our department. And what this unit does is they monitor compliance of housing laws, and they work to make sure that cities are doing what they're supposed to be doing in accordance with the laws that we passed. Just making sure that cities follow the law has already contributed to 3,400 new homes being built that would otherwise be delayed in endless city council processes. So this is pretty important. And we also have a carrot, is illustrated by the carrot, in the form of pro-housing designations. What those are is it's a specific way that cities and counties that are doing the right thing when it comes to housing, making it easier, faster to build, providing local funding, cutting local red tape, places that are being very proactive about it, um, also get a leg up in our funding program. So they get this specific pro-housing designation and they get access to a special funding pot that is just for these types of entities, these types of places. So that way they can build more housing faster. And so this is just a flavor of the work that we do. I know I went about it rather quickly, but I wanted to give you all a sense of how we approach this problem and the types of solutions that HCD is focused on promoting. And I do have some time for questions, but I think we're going to be doing questions jointly. So we can do that then. So thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. And with that, we'll go ahead and pass over the microphone to Ryan, our second speaker. Ryan Finnegan is a Senior Research Associate for the Turner Center of Housing Innovation.
Great, thank you. Is my screen sharing working all right?
Yes.
Oh, great, thanks so much. Thank you to everyone for tuning in and for the League of Women Voters for having me. Folks that want to talk about housing and homelessness at 5:30 on a weekday are my kind of people. So that's great to get to be here with you all. Pedro's talk on HCD's housing related work, I think is a really nice complement because I'm going to focus on some specific homelessness issues that the state has really stepped up on in terms of their efforts to provide new solutions to help people exit homelessness. Before I get into that, I want to talk about a couple of different big picture policy perspectives for thinking about homelessness and ways that we can intervene in the factors that put people at risk of homelessness in the first place, and how do we support people in their journey to exit homelessness. So when we think about the factors that cause homelessness, we can ask two different kinds of questions that will yield different kinds of answers. The first question that I think we're typically focused on is, why do some people experience homelessness while others don't? And there are a lot of systematic factors that can put people at higher or lower risk of homelessness, including systemic racism that puts people of color at heightened risk of homelessness, including issues like mental health challenges or substance use challenges that can be intertwined in the hardships in people's lives that put them at risk of homelessness. But any person that you talk to experiencing homelessness will tell you a story that shows multiple complex overlapping factors that brought them to the position where they find themselves today. And from a policy perspective, That kind of question makes it hard to know what are the levers that we can pull in order to reduce somebody's risk of homelessness. A much more tractable question from a policy perspective is, why do some places have more homelessness than others don't? We often think about things like mental health challenges or poverty or drug-related issues and challenges. But when we think about places that have high or low levels of homelessness, there's an opioid epidemic that has struck the Midwest particularly hard. There's entrenched intergenerational poverty in states in the Deep South, yet neither of those places have the same levels of homelessness that California does. So those kinds of solutions or answers to that question aren't really lining up with what the data show. What the data do bear out about why some places have more homelessness than others is that in California, we have much higher housing costs than other places do. What we're looking at here is a chart that shows you a bubble for every state in the US. The vertical height of the bubble is its rate of homelessness relative to the population. So the higher bubbles have higher rates of homelessness. And from left to right, you're seeing typical housing costs for a 2-bedroom apartment. And then the size of the bubble is the number of people experiencing homelessness in the state. California is in yellow, which has the highest typical cost for a median cost for a 2-bedroom apartment. It has the largest number of people experiencing homelessness, and it has the 3rd highest rate of homelessness relative to the population. And so when we're thinking about why do some places have more homelessness than others, high housing costs create conditions in which the individual factors that might tip somebody into homelessness become more powerful and amplified. People that are struggling with mental health challenges or drug use issues, they can tip into homelessness in California, where housing is expensive, much more easily than they might have happen to them in a place with much more like reasonable or affordable housing costs. So that's one way of trying to think about what are the policy levers that can influence the level of homelessness that we see in California. The other perspective that's helpful to have in mind when thinking about where can we intervene is that homelessness is not a static state that people enter and remain in. Homelessness is a dynamic experience where people can enter for one given set of reasons, they can exit for a different given set of reasons. And the interventions that might be most helpful can vary from one person to the next and at one point in this process relative to another. So the inflow is a major challenge, and all of the programs and efforts to support more affordable and abundant housing that Pedro mentioned are crucial for stemming the inflow of people into homelessness. Some of the programs that I'll talk about in a few minutes are more focused on this central portion. How do we support people in the midst of experiencing homelessness? And what are the interventions that help them exit homelessness most rapidly and most effectively? But it's still important to keep in mind that abundant and affordable housing are crucial for all portions of this spectrum of the experience. Without abundant housing, people exit or enter homelessness at high rates. Without abundant housing, it's difficult to exit homelessness because there's simply no housing to exit to. So in terms of thinking through this kind of process, like Pedro mentioned, there's been major state investments in recent years into our homelessness and housing infrastructure throughout the state. So typically in California's history, homelessness systems are organized locally. So you've got cities, counties, and other kinds of administrative entities and nonprofit service providers all forming networks and service systems that provide things like outreach teams, like temporary shelters, transitional housing, and permanent supportive housing, places for people to exit to and receive a high level of services and care to help them thrive in the housing after they've exited homelessness. And funding for those kinds of interventions typically comes from a combination of local funds, federal funds, often through the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and private funds, small donations, and philanthropy. As little as 5 years ago, the state was investing about $300 million into programs that focus most centrally on homelessness. In the 2021 to 22 budget, there was $7.3 billion from the state addressing homelessness and $3.5 billion addressing housing. Like Pedro mentioned, in this past year, those investments have continued. And what this huge investment from the state does is two things. First, it can expand the scale of services that the state is providing and that localities have access to. Second, it can expand the range of the types of interventions. So with more resources comes more space and capacity to innovate and provide new kinds of solutions to meet the crisis that California is in. These investments are yielding substantial growth in the range of interventions and the scale that are helping people to exit homelessness or at least move from an unsheltered situation to a sheltered situation. The stock of temporary shelter and permanent housing that comes with supportive case management services has increased by about half from 2016 through 2021. And then this new program called, well, it's not super new, but this newly expanded program called Rapid Rehousing has expanded by 150% over the last 5 years. Rapid Rehousing is an intervention that provides people who have most often recently entered homelessness, often for the first time, short-term subsidies to help them find and get back into permanent housing. This is an intervention that's really effective for families that enter homelessness, and they don't necessarily need substantial services in order to get back into housing, but they don't have the first month's rent and the security deposit and the last month's rent that it takes to get back into an apartment on the private market. What they need is just that little bit of help and that little bit of time. And this kind of intervention is really effective for folks in that situation, which there are many in California. And it's an intervention that's been able to grow substantially with new investments in recent years. I'll spend the rest of my time focusing on a couple of more innovative solutions that you may have heard about that rolled out throughout the COVID-19 pandemic in California that focus primarily, but not exclusively, on hotel-motel conversions. At the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, there were about 150,000 people experiencing homelessness in California, about 100,000 of whom were experiencing homelessness in unsheltered situations. The other 50,000 experiencing homelessness most often in large congregate shelters. So these are dorm-like places where there might be anywhere between 6 and 100 people sleeping in the same large space, often in bunk beds. As we know, in the era of COVID-19, kind of the worst possible place that you would want to be, but also for people in unsheltered situations without access to social distancing, personal protective equipment, sanitation, really, really tough circumstances with a dire public health implications. Project Room Key was a program that was funded partly by the federal government, at least initially through FEMA, and then eventually the state and localities also started supplementing these funds. They were renting vacant hotel and motel rooms, but also providing trailers in order to provide people with individual private spaces where they could both have access to social distancing and sanitation and give folks a space to not only be safe, but to plan the next steps for getting back into permanent housing. In order to make that kind of intervention more sustainable and long-term, a few months later, Home Key, rolled out by the Department of Housing and Community Development, provided localities with funding to purchase and convert properties like hotels and motels and turn them into either temporary shelter that provides individual rooms for families or individuals, or to convert them into permanent supportive housing. So long-term housing with wraparound health, social, and case management services. It also gave localities some short-term support for the operations, maintenance, security, case management, and it streamlined the regulations required to do those kinds of conversions. So things like the environmental review, that's the CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, streamlining those kinds of regulations so that people wanting to very quickly create this new kind of shelter and housing have fewer hoops to jump through in order to do so. And these programs provided substantial new supply of temporary shelter and now permanent housing through Home Key. At its peak, Room Key provided over 15,000 units, and the total number of people who cycled through different Room Key sites across the state exceeded 55,000 people. HomeKey is on track to create over 12,000 units so far, and this is a program that's still ongoing. Not all of these units are in service yet. Many of these awards were just given by HCD, but that's a substantial addition to the ability to shelter and provide permanent housing for people across the state. And in our research at the Turner Center, we've done a couple of studies looking both at HomeKey and at the California's homelessness system writ large. We've interviewed a lot of HomeKey operators, homelessness system administrators, people experiencing homelessness. And across all interviews, people described the ability to provide this particular kind of shelter or permanent housing as superior to the kinds of shelter that was most commonly available. Hotels and motels to provide permanent, or rather temporary shelter, is not necessarily a new kind of intervention. A lot of local systems have been renting hotel rooms for years, but no one had really done it at the scale that the state of California did during the pandemic. And one interviewee described this as really echoing, quote, a call for moving away from congregate shelters. When they talk about service resistance, it's because people don't want to be in a room with 60 other people. And so even if this is something that homelessness service providers and people experiencing homelessness knew well before already, the ability to implement this program at scale was a demonstration that it is possible to provide a better option for people that will give them more stability, give them more space, and a greater platform for the transition to permanent housing. One interviewee who is staying in a motel program highlighted the stability that it provided for her. She said, quote, once you get in the room and I know I could be there for a while, it gives me a little time to just relax and breathe. And then with that stability, I feel that people can start addressing the issues that are hindering them from getting housing. Like, do I need to get my ID? Do I need to get a social security card? Are there outstanding bills that I have? And when she had stayed in typical congregate shelters, many of which require residents to leave during the day, she did not have that kind of stability or mental space to think through the next steps to get back into permanent housing. Beyond the quality of the intervention that this kind of program can provide, these programs, given their scale and the resources that they provided, also transformed local homelessness systems in lasting ways. So in one northern city on the Oregon border, somebody who established a HomeKey site with a hotel that they had used to rent rooms for people on a short-term basis said, quote, the 30 rooms and the number of people we had in them, it eliminated 16% of homelessness in our community. And that's huge. Getting to provide 30 new housing units is probably the coolest thing I'll ever do. It's so awesome. It changed the landscape of our housing in our community. Other interviewees also highlighted the importance of the new partnerships that were forged through the people that established HomeKey sites together. HomeKey sites are typically purchased, or they were purchased and operated by public entities, so local city governments, county governments, housing authorities, but they partnered with housing developers or property managers and service providers to support the residents that were moving into them. And for many of these service providers, the relationships that created through doing these HomeKey projects benefited them above and beyond the HomeKey project itself. One service provider said, the biggest win is a great relationship with our housing authority. That service provider felt like getting to know their housing authority and the people that worked in it allowed them to understand the kinds of housing assistance that were available in their community much better and support their clients for getting connected to that assistance in a way that they weren't able to do before. To give you just a couple of concrete examples of what this can look like in different places, not all projects are hotel motel conversions, although many of them are. But localities implemented them with a wide range of flexibility to meet the unique needs of their communities. Fresno is implementing HomeKey on a scale that dwarfs what many localities are doing because HomeKey fit a particular vision that they had for not only transforming their homelessness and housing systems, but also implementing it as a neighborhood level intervention. What's pictured here is a stretch of about 15 motels along Highway 99 in Fresno that they call Motel Drive. These are motels that are adjacent to a residential area. They're often used as kind of very precarious temporary housing for people experiencing or at risk of homelessness, and many were in poor physical condition. What the Fresno Housing Authority had in mind was the ability to convert these motels into permanent supportive housing for people exiting homelessness, but also using a variety of other state programs and tax subsidies, construct mixed income housing in the parking lots of the motels, in the empty lots adjacent to the motel stretch. And so what they said was that the quote, "We knew that the impact we were looking for really required multiple properties." And they said that the financing those acquisitions was their biggest hurdle for implementing this vision that had been in the works for years. And they said, quote, "When HomeKey came around, that was the answer that we were looking for." Riverside is implementing the HomeKey program in a very different way. They're also making a transformation in their homelessness service system, but instead of it being on a large scale, they're thinking about transforming relationships on a much more specific scale with individual service providers. So the Riverside County talked about using HomeKey in a way that made, quote, "anchor level investments in some of their service partners." One of which is pictured here, is eventually going to become a 49-unit project that converts a cluster of adjacent large multi-use residential commercial houses into what they call a community campus by a service provider called True Evolution. They provide services related to healthcare and HIV/AIDS, predominantly for LGBTQ people and people of color. And so in addition to providing housing stability and wraparound social and health care for residents living with HIV/AIDS, they want to use this community campus as a hub for their services for the people that they support above and beyond the residents that will live in this particular campus. And so the executive director of that nonprofit said, "I think for the homeless, for LGBTQ folks, when you're in places in Riverside County, there's no congregating space. And so they're experiencing a variety of issues, and we just want to create a safe space for those communities." These projects are transforming many of their local landscapes, but in order to sustainably and durably reduce homelessness in California, the capital alone is not enough. Resolving homelessness requires sustained effort and resources. As one HomeKey operator said, quote, "The moral of the story to me is, if our society wants these to be replicable and sustainable, we need to invest in them. We're literally housing people who've been homeless for decades." And so it not only requires money for the maintenance and continued operations and upkeep, but also the social and health supports that will help the residents truly thrive within those residential locations. And then finally, above and beyond HomeKey, many of the people that participated in these programs and implemented them on the ground described that it was not just a single program that was showing progress. One operator said, quote, "HomeKey shows that we can have big goals and we can move fast. It signals to folks you're not going to have to live outdoors. It starts from the premise that we can solve homelessness with urgency, resources, collaboration, and political will." And I think that's one of the most important things to keep in mind with programs like HomeKey, is that when we try to think about what's the solution to homelessness, a silver bullet is not going to appear. The reasons that people enter and how they experience homelessness and how they can exit it are widely varied depending on their individual needs. And so what we need is a diverse toolkit of options that are sustainable, that are well supported, and that people have the expertise to implement on the ground. And that also helps us try to reconcile what might seem like a contradiction in California, where on the one hand, homelessness has increased and we're in the midst of a dire crisis. On the other hand, our investments and our efforts to end homelessness have increased, and the efficacy of our interventions and local systems have also gotten better with time. And so it's difficult to try to reconcile those two seemingly contradictory truths, that homelessness is an emergency, but we're also getting better at addressing it. But I think trying to think about what those individual systems and interventions look like, and homelessness as a dynamic process, help us to understand how that can be the case. Thanks so much. Happy to answer people's questions. And please feel free to drop by the Turner Center's website if you want to learn more about our work and see some of our published reports. We also have a newsletter with an excellent comms manager who puts together a fantastic newsletter every month. So please feel free to sign up for that if you'd like to learn more about our work. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Ryan. With that, we'll go ahead and dive into Q&A. If you have questions, again, reminder, if you have questions for our speakers, feel free to type it in the Q&A chat portion on the bottom of your Zoom screen, and I will read them aloud for our speakers to address. We do have our first question. Our first question is, living wage has to be in the mix. There are people that are homeless working multiple jobs, and I believe this was in reference to Pedro's data analysis showing like the little different mixes, but feel free to both answer this question.
Well, I can take a stab, but Ryan, please feel free to chime in. Absolutely. Living wage is a critical part of the equation. As Ryan said, there are multiple reasons people fall into homelessness, but the core, most basic one is a lot of people simply are not making enough to get by, and having a living wage is a critical part of that solution. In the bills that I mentioned, AB 2011 and SB 6, both of those bills require that developers who take advantage of the flexibility that those bills allow, which is to build in areas where normally you can't build housing, commercially zoned areas, you have to pay high wages. Either these are prevailing wages, which are set at the state level and are considered a living wage for construction jobs, or you have to hire unionized, highly skilled workers, also known as a skilled and trained workforce, depending on which pathway you take. And yeah, absolutely agree that getting people's income levels up so that they can afford to stay housed is a critical part of the solution.
I totally agree with that as well.
Perfect, thank you. With that, we'll go into our second question that we have from our chat. It is, I understand that a few hotels in San Francisco are suing the city to get reimbursement for thousands/millions of dollars of damages that people in temporary housing did to the hotels. How can such damages be prevented? Security arrangements in the temporary housing, permanent in housing that will be built and maintained by the cities.
Yeah, so localities really varied in terms of how they implemented them. I think particularly because room key and home key were implemented so quickly. There's just this urgency to get going as fast as possible. And so they didn't always get a lot of guidance at the front end for things that you might expect, but also these programs were never really implemented at this scale. And so I think there were a lot of unforeseen challenges. One thing that we did hear from a lot of room key and home key operators was first that their security, they went a lot of different routes. Home key also required site control and like gates and kind of some regulation of who could come and go from the sites. And room key sites also implemented different models for trying to maintain security. In terms of room damage, that for sure happens. Some of the home key sites are just kind of bundling it into some of their operating costs, is that sometimes there's infrastructure damage. What we heard a lot is that, particularly for folks who've been experiencing chronic unsheltered homelessness, there's a couple of weeks of, like, as they described it, decompression that sometimes have to happen, where it's a major adjustment with a lot of whiplash for some folks when they're living in a hotel motel. Particularly in the beginning of the pandemic, I think it was really hard because not only were folks changing their living circumstances really rapidly, they also had to isolate. And so they were socially isolated in the midst of that transition. And so there were a lot of really tough situations all around. I have not heard as much about those challenges from home key projects as the projects have continued. But I do think that there was some turbulence for folks as they first entered them, and in the beginning stages of the programs. And so I think being aware of that and trying to plan accordingly now that we have that experience behind us is going to be an important part of trying to make the projects work.
Thank you, Ryan. And with that, we'll go to our next question, our third question. Our third question is a great program on a practical level. Might HCD talk about local housing element advocacy, how to get involved, and the teeth state laws offer to keep cities on target, how to call cities into question for non-compliance. Thanks.
Thank you for asking that question. I love it. Absolutely, please get involved with housing element advocacy. It really depends where you are at and what kind of outreach your local city is doing. So where I live, my town actually actually has been emailing me pamphlets every time that they have housing element meetings. So if you're getting a mailer, that's a great way, you already know when it's happening, where, go to those meetings, learn about what they're doing. If you haven't received anything, another way to do it is housing elements have to be adopted through public meetings of the city council. So if you just put city name, comma, housing element update, something should come up. And that's a great way for you to just find out information. And there are many housing advocacy groups throughout the state. So depending where you are, there is likely to be a local housing advocacy organization that you can get involved with. So you might even want to put in city name, housing element advocacy, and you may even get a letter that they sent to the city on that regard. So there are multiple ways to find out that information, and it just depends where you are. As far as teeth in the state law and holding cities accountable, if you think there is a violation of state law, and you have some documentation to show that, HCD has an email that's almost like a complaint line. It's called compliance review at hcd.ca.gov. And Julissa, I'm sending it in the chat, but if you can send it to everybody, that'd be great. And that's an email that goes directly to our team here, who looks at the potential violation of housing law that might have happened and investigates it and then takes action accordingly, depending on whether or not there's something there. And so that's another way for you to get involved. I would also say for housing elements in particular, there are multiple consequences. So every time a city sends us a draft, we review it. We take 60 days to review it. We send them detailed comments on how their housing element is hitting the mark or not hitting the mark and exactly what they need to do to address it. If they don't address those concerns, then they are out of compliance. If they stay out of compliance, then depending on how badly out of compliance they are, developers might be able to literally go and say, I want to build this building and you can't stop me for a number of years. And so the consequences are quite severe because cities don't like losing control over these types of decisions. And so I know this was a bit long-winded, but do look up, your city's name, housing element update. That's a great way of getting information, and use the compliance review inbox to report any housing violations to us, and we will look into them.
I love to hear that there's an email someone can reach out to. That's amazing. With that, we'll go on to our next question. Our next question is the fourth question. I'll go ahead and add it to our panelists in the chat as well. Their question is, PRK and Home Key are admittedly great resources to add to the continuum of shelter solutions, but I'm curious about the long-term impact on coordinating ongoing resources/services and supports. Does this favor home key projects that are transitional programs as opposed to more permanent options? Has there been enough HMKY projects to analyze this?
Great question, one that I spend a lot of time thinking about. And so the answer is complex. Any given home key project, they weigh a number of factors in terms of planning what kind of a project they're going to be, either providing interim shelter or permanent supportive housing. The majority of home key projects either are already providing permanent supportive housing or plan to convert to permanent supportive housing in the coming year or two. So most are going the permanent housing route. Among the factors that project developers and operators weigh, one is that there are different kinds of funding resources available depending on whether you're providing interim shelter or permanent housing. For folks providing permanent housing, there are different kinds of assistance that actually might make it more financially sustainable to provide permanent supportive housing than interim shelter. For example, in permanent supportive housing, you might be able to pair a housing voucher to support the costs of the operations for the property. But for a temporary shelter, you can't leverage that kind of a resource. So for permanent supportive housing, there are some ways where it becomes more financially sustainable. Other kinds of choices might be much more pragmatic. Some communities, particularly rural or more suburban areas, they've opted to go with interim shelter because they simply don't have any in their area. So there's one project where the interim shelter that they've converted a motel to is the closest interim shelter in their town by like 25 miles. And so they saw that as the largest gap in their continuum of options. Finally, there's also the pragmatic realization of what a property will or won't be suitable for. So in many cases, it was difficult to find a property that would be both quick and relatively cost efficient to convert and have people that were willing to sell. And so for some properties, it might be the case that the motel rooms in that property are relatively small and maybe provide a perfectly suitable temporary option for folks. But in terms of a long-term permanent housing option where somebody might live for many years and hopefully thrive, that small room simply isn't going to provide sufficient space for that. And so there was a pragmatic choice to go with interim housing instead.
Thank you, Ryan. And I forgot to mention that that same question was also followed by the person saying thank you to both presenters and LWV for presenting and creating this. So just wanted to say that was a sweet note. And with that, we'll go ahead and go on to our next question. Our next question is, I've heard the term wraparound services for room key, home key projects. How is that working? I have heard that sometimes that it is inadequate.
Yeah, that it varies a lot across different parts of the state. It depends a lot on the partnerships that individual projects might have. So if a project is being operated jointly between a local public entity and a very high capacity service provider with a long, experience providing these kinds of services, it can work really well. But there are places that don't have that same depth of service providers. So I live in the Bay Area, which is a place where there's a pretty deep field of organizations providing homelessness services. But throughout the Central Valley or in the northern part of the state, there might be many fewer potential partners. And so that can be one of the constraints for providing the services that people really need to do well in these residential options. Another constraint that's related to it is that there's a pretty challenging statewide staffing shortage. Homelessness services is hard. It's really, really hard work. People burn out pretty often because the work is hard. It doesn't pay especially well. And it's hard to find folks with the specific kinds of skill combinations that it needs to do the work really well. Folks need to be able to establish trust, rapport, and care with the people that they're serving, but they also need to have an aptitude for a lot of paperwork, frankly. And that combination of skills isn't always super common, but both are really important for being an effective case manager or supporting folks as they're exiting homelessness. So there are definitely some headwinds that are stronger in some parts of the state than the others. Like Pedro mentioned, that $1 billion that the governor just released to localities, that is a funding source that many localities are using to provide the services side. So a program like Home Key provides the capital to convert these properties. This program, it's called HAP. It can provide the services funding to try to support that case management. So there's kind of a mosaic of state programs and some other federal and local sources that folks are leveraging to try to provide those case management services, but it's definitely a challenge.
Definitely. And our next question is, can you address how to deal with NIMBYs, especially former city council members who work outside the political realm?
Yes, I think that's something that we encounter all the time and frankly has pushed the state to the crisis that we're in now. You know, housing is always great if you build it elsewhere. We need more housing, just don't build it in my neighborhood. And there's so many arguments against it. And you can't help sometimes that some people who feel very strongly against building any housing have strong political connections. So I think the biggest thing is churning out. Being a voice in favor of more housing is critical. It does make a difference. I have seen it happen myself, even though it sounds cliche, especially at the local level, having local constituents come out and say, no, I want this housing in my neighborhood makes a tremendous difference. So that's number one. Number two is sometimes even if you do come out and you do put together a really strong campaign to get housing built, it doesn't work out. But you think that they violated a state law. Well, let us know. Actually, let us know. We have been empowered to look into these matters. And if a state law is being violated, we do let cities know that, and we do work with them to get the housing built. Um, and I would also say education in general. You know, a lot of people have a lot of misconceptions about housing or what it'll do or their property values. And I think literally just if you know the person, just having a conversation about it, not from a labels perspective, like, oh, you are a NIMBY, so I'm going to tell you this. Really just being like, so why are you concerned about this? Why, you know, what do you think it'll do to the neighborhood? And what about this other building that was just built here? And did anything bad happen? You know, and draw them out because it also starts there too. And people do eventually change their opinions, even if it takes a long time and a lot of hard work.
Thank you. Brian, would you like to add anything to that question? No, you're good. Okay, so it looks like we are at time. That is about an hour. Thank you all for joining us. A big thanks to our speakers for presenting today. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Pedro. I did want to let everyone know who is on is that we have recorded the discussion. It's recorded and we'll be sending this out to our attendees this week. Again, thank you both for taking time out of your day, your evening to be here with us and really dive into these wonderful questions. With that, I hope you guys all have a good evening.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks all.
Bye.